Hello, sleepless travelers. Ready for tonight's medieval adventure?
Hey, traveler. Tonight, I thought we'd talk about the Colosseum. Where are you in the world right now, and what time is it there? Let me know in the comments. It's wonderful to know where our fellow travelers are joining us from tonight. What if you received an invitation, not to a fancy ball, but to witness gladiators clash in mortal combat? That was the reality for Roman citizens when the Colosseum, originally known as the Flavian Amphitheater, flung open its massive doors. Imagine the anticipation, a Super Bowl combined with a rock concert, but with a much higher chance of someone actually dying. News of the games didn't spread via Twitter, obviously. Instead, town criers would bellow announcements, and whispers would travel through the bustling Roman streets and markets. Bread and circuses, bread and circuses, a phrase coined to describe the Roman people's desire for food and entertainment above all else. You can almost hear the whispers. They say Flavius is fighting a lion tomorrow. I hear he lost to the lion. This colossal structure, built by emperors of the Flavian dynasty, Vespasian and his son Titus, wasn't just a stadium. It was a statement of power, of imperial generosity, and of Rome's dominance. Vespasian started the construction around 70 to 72 AD, after the chaotic year of the four emperors. Talk about job creation. It was finished by his son Titus in 80 AD and was further modified during Domitian's reign. The Colosseum stood as an impressive symbol, reminding people that Rome was in charge. It was as if they were saying, "Look what we can build. Try messing with us now." Now that we've covered the construction, let's talk about expectations. For the Roman people, the Colosseum represented more than just entertainment. It was a place where social hierarchies were reinforced, where political messages were subtly delivered, and where the emperors could show off their wealth and power. Think of it as a giant reality TV show, but with real consequences. It was expected to pacify the masses and to provide a distraction from the everyday hardships of life. Kind of like Netflix, but with more blood. Speaking of attending, you couldn't just waltz in. Admission to the Colosseum was, in theory, free for Roman citizens, a perk of being part of the empire. However, it wasn't exactly a free-for-all. Tickets, or tesserae, were often distributed by wealthy patrons or government officials, ensuring that the right people got the best seats. So imagine winning tickets to a championship game today, but only if you promise to wear a t-shirt supporting the team owner. Some things never change. Finding your seat was a bit like navigating a crowded airport during the holidays. The Colosseum was meticulously organized, with different sections reserved for different social classes. Senators sat close to the action, enjoying the best views. Knights, wealthy merchants, and ordinary citizens occupied the middle tiers. Women and slaves were relegated to the upper levels, further away from the spectacle. If you've ever been stuck in the nosebleed section at a concert, you have a slight idea of what that was like. Key takeaway: the Colosseum was a microcosm of Roman society, complete with its own rigid social hierarchy. From social class to location, let's discuss the actual process. Once inside, You'd be guided to your designated section by ushers. These weren't your friendly neighborhood volunteers. They were more like stern bouncers, ensuring that everyone stayed in their assigned place. Forget about sneaking into a better seat. The place was tightly controlled. You might think getting past airport security today is tough, but try arguing with a Roman usher armed with a gladius. But what good is this spectacular seating arrangement without some sort of added comfort? As you settled into your seat, the anticipation would build. Vendors hawked snacks and drinks, maybe not popcorn and soda, but perhaps some bread, olives, and watered-down wine. And the roar of the crowd, the sheer energy of thousands of people gathered together, would be palpable. You could practically taste the excitement in the air. It would have been a completely immersive experience. Key takeaway: the Colosseum was a full sensory experience, from the sights and sounds to the smells and, yes, even the tastes. Now that we've talked about comfort, let's talk about the atmosphere. Imagine a stadium filled with roaring crowds, chanting and cheering, sunlight blazing down, reflecting off the marble walls, the air thick with the smell of sweat, dust, and maybe a hint of blood. The energy was electric, a potent mix of excitement, fear, and bloodlust. It's probably similar to the feeling you get during overtime at a close hockey game.
The dawn breaks, not with bird song, but with the clang of metal. Imagine the Colosseum, not as the silent ruin it is today, but teeming, vibrating with anticipation. If you've ever been to a major sporting event, that electric hum before the kickoff, multiply it by 100. This was Rome's Super Bowl, only with significantly more potential for death. The morning's procession, a spectacle in itself, began well before the midday games. It was a carefully orchestrated display of power, a visual feast designed to both impress and intimidate. Now that we've talked about the building, let's explore what was going on inside. First, picture the parade. Not just any parade, but a grand procession led by the sponsors of the games, often the emperor himself, or a wealthy, ambitious nobleman eager to curry favor. Think of it as a modern-day celebrity walk, except instead of flashing cameras, you have thousands of expectant eyes, and instead of designer dresses, there are gleaming chariots and legionnaires in full battle armor. It was all for show, a chance for the elite to demonstrate their largesse and solidify their status. Key takeaway? The procession was a meticulously crafted tool for political theater. Following the dignitaries came the gladiators themselves. A motley crew they were, some volunteers, others slaves, all bound by fate to this sandy arena. They weren't quite rock stars, but they were certainly celebrities. Gladiators, even low-ranking ones, had fans. Their victories, and sometimes even their defeats, were legendary. The armor they carried, polished to a blinding sheen, reflected the morning sun like 1,000 tiny mirrors. Imagine having to carry that thing around. Then came the animals, lions, tigers, bears, oh my, all caged and snarling, adding an element of primal danger to the proceedings. These weren't cuddly zoo animals. They were apex predators, ripped from their natural habitats and thrust into the heart of Roman civilization. The sheer logistics of transporting these creatures across vast distances is mind-boggling. From ferocious beasts to heavily armed warriors, it was a true representation of Rome's empire and power. From mighty rulers to fierce animals, the procession was a visual representation of Rome's global dominance. It was quite a show. But what good is a parade without some weapons? The display of gladiatorial arms and armor was a crucial part of the morning's ritual. Each type of gladiator had their own unique set of weaponry and protection. The heavily armored secutor, with his gladius and large shield, the nimble retiarius, with his net and trident, the thraex, with his curved sword and small shield. These items, meticulously maintained and often richly decorated, were paraded before the crowd, showcasing the variety and skill that would be on display. Now that we've covered the hardware, let's talk about the software. It wasn't just about brute force. It was about strategy, technique, and yes, even showmanship. Gladiators were trained to entertain, to put on a good show for the crowd. But what good is a skilled warrior without a proper setting? The fanfare was essential. Trumpets blared, drums thundered, and the air vibrated with the energy of the crowd. It was a sensory overload, designed to heighten the excitement and build the anticipation. The Romans understood the power of spectacle, and they weren't afraid to use it. Speaking of showmanship, this brings us to the religious and social significance attached to these opening ceremonies. The games weren't just entertainment. They were deeply intertwined with Roman religion and social order. The opening ceremonies often included prayers to the gods and rituals designed to ensure the success of the games and the safety of the participants. It was a way of appeasing the divine and reinforcing the connection between the Roman people and their deities. Key takeaway? The Colosseum wasn't just a sporting arena, it was a sacred space. The social significance was equally important. The games provided a space for all levels of Roman society to come together, to witness the power of the empire, and to reaffirm their shared identity. It was a unifying experience, a reminder of Rome's strength and glory. If you've ever seen people celebrating their nation's victory, think of the energy that was building in the Colosseum. Behind the scenes, the Colosseum was a hive of activity. Slaves and attendants scurried about, preparing the arena, tending to the animals, and ensuring that everything ran smoothly. It was a complex operation, requiring meticulous planning and coordination. Consider the people needed behind the scenes to clean up the blood and guts from prior events. It was not a pretty job. The key players involved in the morning's procession included not only the emperor and the gladiators, but also the lanista, the editor, and the pampa circensis. Each played a crucial role in ensuring the success of the spectacle. The lanista were responsible for the training and well-being of the gladiators. If you've ever worked in a high-pressure environment, imagine the stress of being responsible for the lives of these warriors. The editor invested huge sums into the games, hoping to gain prestige from a good show. The palpable sense of anticipation that built before the first event was almost tangible. The crowd roared, the trumpets blared, and the gladiators stood ready. The stage was set for a day of bloodshed and glory. The energy was intense.
You could feel it in the air. The morning's procession wasn't just a prelude to the games. It was an integral part of the spectacle, a carefully crafted performance designed to impress, intimidate, and unite the Roman people. It was a display of power, a celebration of Roman culture, and a testament to the enduring fascination with violence and entertainment. It was quite a show. Think of it as an ancient Hollywood premiere, but with more lions. But what good is a beautiful show without its audience? So the next time you can't sleep and find yourself pondering the mysteries of the past, imagine yourself standing in the Colosseum, bathed in the morning sun, surrounded by the roar of the crowd, and witnessing the spectacle of the morning's procession. Let the echoes of history soothe your restless mind. Long before television, the Romans had perfected the art of captivating an audience.
The Colosseum, that grand arena of spectacle and death. But what was it like to be a spectator there, especially when the venationes, the animal hunts, took center stage? Imagine, if you will, the modern equivalent of a monster truck rally. But instead of trucks, it's lions, tigers, and bears battling terrified or perhaps surprisingly skilled humans. The air itself would be thick with anticipation, fear, and the pungent scent of exotic animals, a veritable zoo crammed into the bowels of the arena. Now that we have the atmosphere, picture a crowd, not unlike a modern-day stadium throng, but clad in togas and tunics. Their faces a mix of classes, rich and poor, all united in their bloodlust, or perhaps a strange fascination. What would you do? The bestiarii, the animal handlers and hunters, weren't your typical gladiators. These were often condemned criminals, slaves, or sometimes even volunteers seeking fame. Their skill lay not just in combat, but in understanding animal behavior, anticipating their movements, and wielding specialized weapons. Speaking of weapons, it's not like they were going in there with a pea shooter. Spears, nets, and even whips were employed in this deadly dance. But get this, they probably weren't paid all that great. Now that is a low-wage job, even in ancient times. The animals themselves, the animals. Elephants from Africa, bears from Germania, crocodiles from the Nile, creatures from the far corners of the Roman Empire, all brought to Rome for this ultimate display of power and domination. It's like a really, really terrible episode of Planet Earth. But what good is all this spectacle without a little context? The Roman fascination with the wild was twofold. Firstly, it was a demonstration of Rome's power, its ability to conquer and control even the most fearsome beasts. Secondly, it was a way to satisfy the public's thirst for the exotic and the dangerous. But imagine the ecological impact. The sheer number of animals captured and transported for these games must have been devastating to local populations. It's like the Romans were single-handedly creating endangered species. Now that we've covered the impact, let's move to preparations. The preparations for a venaccio were extensive. Animals were often starved to make them more aggressive, and the bestiari underwent rigorous training. It was a savage performance, meticulously planned and brutally executed. Now that's what I call commitment. This brings us to the heart of the matter. How did the bestiari actually feel? Did they relish the challenge, finding a perverse sense of freedom in their dangerous profession? Or were they simply resigned to their fate, viewing each day as a step closer to inevitable death? It's doubtful there were many therapists on hand to help them process their trauma. Ever wonder if some of them secretly rooted for the animals? The reality is likely a mix of both. Some may have found a twisted sense of pride in their ability to survive, while others were undoubtedly filled with fear and despair. From training to the feelings of the bestiari, it leads to one key takeaway. The venationes were a brutal spectacle that highlighted Rome's power, its fascination with the wild, and the often grim realities of life in the arena. Picture the smell of blood, sweat, and fear hanging in the air, mixing with the cheers and jeers of the crowd. It's a far cry from a relaxing night at the movies.
The Colosseum. Even the name echoes with a brutal grandeur. If you've ever been kept awake by a late-night action movie marathon, you might have a sliver of understanding of the adrenaline that coursed through the veins of spectators there. What was it truly like to witness such spectacles in ancient Rome? Gladiatorial combat wasn't simply mindless violence. It was a complex tapestry woven with threads of honor, skill, and the desperate will to survive. Think of it as the ancient Roman equivalent of professional wrestling, only with significantly higher stakes, seriously higher stakes, like death by lion higher. But medieval people, they didn't have the internet or Netflix. The difference was, entertainment was raw, unfiltered, and very, very public. Sure, it wasn't perfect, but when your alternative was, like watching paint dry, a gladiator fight looked pretty brilliant. Now that we've set the stage, let's talk about the gladiators themselves. Who were these men and women who faced death as a form of entertainment? Forget the romanticized Hollywood image for a moment. The reality was far more nuanced. Gladiators came from all walks of life. Some were slaves, condemned criminals forced to fight for their lives. Others were prisoners of war, their fate decided by the whims of their captors. And then there were the volunteers. These individuals, often driven by debt, the promise of fame, or simply a thirst for adventure, willingly entered the arena. Imagine signing up for a job where the potential bonus is eternal glory, but the most likely outcome is being impaled by a trident. Harsh 401k plan. Speaking of backgrounds, this brings us to the different fighting styles. Gladiators weren't just thrown into the arena with a sword and told to figure it out. They were highly trained specialists, each mastering a particular fighting style and weaponry. There was the thrax, armed with a curved sword and a small shield. The moreㅅ, with his gladius and heavy shield, often facing the retiarius,
who wielded a net and trident. Talk about an unfair matchup. It was the medieval version of rock, paper, scissors, but with more blood and sand. The training regimen was brutal, a relentless process of honing their skills and building their strength. Gladiators lived in specialized schools, ludi, where they were subjected to rigorous discipline and constant practice. They weren't just warriors, they were athletes, celebrities, and ultimately expendable commodities. But what good is a spectacle without an audience? The Colosseum could hold an estimated 50,000 to 80,000 spectators, a vast sea of faces eager for entertainment. Imagine the roar of the crowd, the smell of sweat and blood, the palpable tension hanging in the air. It was a sensory overload. People from all social classes flocked to the Colosseum, from the emperor himself to the lowliest plebeian. The seating arrangements reflected the rigid social hierarchy of Roman society. The higher your status, the closer you were to the action. Ever wonder what it was like to be in that crowd? Think of it as the Super Bowl, but with significantly more potential for on-field fatalities. Seriously, the NFL could learn a thing or two about dramatic pauses. The audience wasn't just a passive observer. They were an active participant in the spectacle. Their cheers and jeers could influence the outcome of a fight, swaying the emperor's decision on whether to grant a defeated gladiator mercy. The power of the crowd was immense, a force that could both elevate and condemn. Now that we've peeked behind the curtain of the gladiatorial world, let's delve into the psychology of survival within the arena. Every gladiator entering the Colosseum knew there was a very real chance they wouldn't be leaving. Yet they fought on, driven by a potent combination of fear, desperation, and the hope for glory. Survival in the arena wasn't just about brute strength and skill. It was about cunning, strategy, and the ability to read your opponent. Gladiators had to be masters of deception, using feints and trickery to gain the upper hand. It was the ultimate test of skill under insane pressure. Remember, there's a chance for lions and tigers and even bears. It's insane. So in this scenario, no one would volunteer for any reason. But Romans didn't have the NFL, so it was pretty much it. The difference was, entertainment was raw, unfiltered, and very, very public. Sure, it wasn't perfect, but when your alternative was, like watching paint dry, a gladiator fight looked pretty brilliant. Key takeaway. The Colosseum was more than just a place of death. It was a stage where honor, skill, and survival were constantly tested.
The sands of choice. Ever wonder what it felt like to sit in the Colosseum, not as a participant, but as a spectator? It wasn't just entertainment. It was a matter of life and death, decided by the whims of the crowd. Imagine reality TV, but with significantly higher stakes and less scripted drama. Though I suspect some fights were staged, perhaps with more dramatic flair than your average wrestling match, the theatrics were real. The gladiatorial combat itself was a brutal ballet. It wasn't just mindless hacking and slashing. There were rules,
referees, and specific techniques. Think of it as a very violent chess game, where each move could be your last. These fighters were highly trained, specializing in different weapons and fighting styles. Moreㅅ with his sword and shield resembling a fish, and the retiarius, armed with a net and trident, engaged in a deadly dance, a watery nightmare for the Moreㅅ if the retiarius was skilled. Now that we've set the stage, let's step into the heart of the arena. The referee, often an ex-gladiator himself, played a crucial role. His job was to enforce the rules, prevent excessively brutal or unfair fighting, and ensure a fair outcome. He would use a rod to separate combatants, giving a gladiator a chance to catch his breath or adjust his position, a brief respite in a maelstrom of violence. But what good is a referee without the crowd's opinion? The gestures of the crowd were what truly mattered, thumbs up or down. Now historians argue about the exact meaning. Was it a thumbs up to kill or a thumbs down to spare? The prevailing theory suggests a thumbs up meant death, while a closed fist with a turned thumb meant mercy. If you've ever felt the weight of peer pressure, imagine wielding that power over another human being. The emotional impact of these decisions was immense. The fate of a defeated gladiator hung in the balance, determined by the roar of the crowd. Imagine the surge of adrenaline, the desperation, and the final acceptance of whatever fate awaited them. But what did death mean in the arena? It wasn't just an end, it was a spectacle. Death in the arena was a complex thing. For some, it was a release from slavery. For others, it was a chance to achieve a kind of immortality, their names and deeds etched in the collective memory of the Roman populace. Think of it as a twisted form of fame. The gladiators, facing their final moments, were probably thinking about all the choices that led them there, all their training and the crowd's emotions. They probably felt regret, fear, and maybe a strange sense of honor, a bizarre form of respect earned through violence. Speaking of the respect, let's think about what that meant for the fighters. Key takeaway: the Colosseum was more than just blood sport. It was a complex interplay of skill, spectacle, and the brutal power of public opinion. But what about the families? If they were alive, how did they feel about their son, brother, or husband fighting for their life in the arena? Think of the emotional toll that took on them. It was very much like modern-day sports and how those players pushed themselves to the limit. Let's consider the gladiator's perspective. Imagine being ripped from your home, forced into slavery, and trained to kill or be killed. The mental fortitude required must have been extraordinary. The training was intense, designed to forge men into weapons. They learned to fight with a variety of weapons, to anticipate their opponent's moves, and to survive. It's like a deadly form of martial arts.
It certainly wasn't perfect, but it was better than not being able to defend yourself. It gave them a chance at survival in a world that seemed to have abandoned them. They probably thought about their past, their families, their hopes and dreams, all of them flashing before their eyes in those final moments. It's a universal human experience. From fighting in wars to playing the Colosseum, those humans had to overcome the fear and emotional obstacles. Now that we've considered the gladiator's perspective, let's consider what was happening after the fight, no matter the outcome. The bodies of the dead were dragged from the arena. The victorious gladiator received his reward, perhaps a palm branch, a crown of laurel, or even a monetary prize. The crowd dispersed, their bloodlust temporarily sated, ready to return another day for more. The sands were raked, the blood washed away, and the arena was prepared for the next spectacle, and the cycle would begin again. So next time you're struggling to fall asleep, imagine yourself in the Colosseum, not as a gladiator, but as a spectator, witnessing the drama, the violence, and the ultimate power over life and death. Good night.
The roar fades, doesn't it? The Colosseum, once a cauldron of human passions, slowly cools. What echoes linger when the sand is no longer stained crimson, when the trumpets are silent? This is where our journey pauses, at the twilight of gladiatorial combat. If you've ever felt the weight of tradition shifting beneath your feet, you understand the late Roman Empire. For centuries, the games had been woven into the fabric of society. They were political theater, religious ritual, and, let's be honest, a really good excuse to drink a lot of wine. But like a toga that's been worn a few too many times, the seams started to fray. People began to question, what good is sport if it's ultimately a death sentence to some? Now that we've set the scene, let's talk about one of the biggest factors in the Colosseum's slow decline, the rise of Christianity. Early Christians weren't exactly fans. Imagine trying to preach about love and forgiveness while people are gleefully watching a lion rip apart a condemned criminal. Awkward, right? They saw the games as barbaric, a pagan spectacle that glorified violence, and they were pretty vocal about it. It was a culture clash of epic proportions, like trying to play death metal at a yoga retreat. Speaking of culture clashes, social attitudes were changing in general. Even some Romans who weren't particularly religious started to feel uneasy about the whole death for entertainment thing. The constant warfare on the frontiers was already taking a toll on the collective psyche. Maybe watching more people die wasn't the best way to unwind after a hard day of conquering. You know, a little like choosing to watch a horror film after having a nightmare. Here's the thing, though. It wasn't a sudden overnight conversion.
The games didn't vanish in a puff of smoke. It was a gradual process of slow turning of the tide. Emperors started to phase out certain types of combats, and gladiatorial schools gradually diminished in importance. But what good is political and societal shift without a good story? Legend has it that a monk named Telemachus in the early 5th century bravely jumped into the arena to stop a gladiatorial contest. He was promptly stoned to death by the crowd. Tragic, yes, but it's said that his sacrifice helped to finally put an end to gladiatorial combat. Key takeaway: the end of the games wasn't a bang, but a slow fade, influenced by changing beliefs and social norms. From spectacle to sacred space, the Colosseum's transformation didn't end with the gladiators. Over time, it became a site of religious significance. Christians saw it as a place sanctified by the blood of martyrs. The arena floor became overgrown with vegetation. Earthquakes toppled sections of the outer wall. For centuries, it was quarried for stone to build new churches and palaces. The Colosseum became a silent monument, a reminder of a bygone era. It was a repurposing on a grand scale, like turning a disco into a library. Sure, the library might not have the same wild energy, but it's probably a bit more conducive to quiet contemplation. And speaking of quiet contemplation, the Colosseum stands today as a testament to the enduring power of spectacle. We still crave entertainment. We still gather in vast numbers to watch sporting events, concerts, and theatrical performances. The difference, of course, is that we don't cheer for people to die. Unless you're a hockey fan, then maybe a little. The lasting impact of these games lies in their echoes. We see them in our modern sports, in our political rallies, even in our reality TV shows. The Roman ability to stage grand spectacles, to manipulate emotions, to create heroes and villains, still resonates within our culture. Now that we've come to the end of the content, let's understand this. The Colosseum, in its prime, was the ultimate reality show. Key takeaway: the Colosseum teaches us that the human desire for spectacle is timeless, even if the form changes. As our journey draws to a close, think back to the gladiators, the emperors, the roaring crowds. Imagine the sheer audacity of building such a structure, of staging such events. And remember that even the mightiest empires eventually crumble, leaving behind only echoes in the stone. But what good are echoes without someone to listen? And so, as the night deepens and the stars begin to fade, perhaps you'll carry a piece of ancient Rome with you, a sense of wonder, a touch of melancholy, a whisper of the past in the quiet stillness. Thank you for joining me on this historical exploration. Sleep well, and may your dreams be filled with the whispers of emperors and the clash of steel.